The golden signet ring resting on the edge of my bedside table was not my husband's, nor was it a piece of jewelry I had ever seen in our house during the 14 years of our marriage. It belonged to my younger sister, Evelyn, who had supposedly spent the last 3 months working at a design firm in Milan. Next to it lay an open manila folder containing a certified psychological evaluation bearing my name, stamped by a private clinic I had never visited, declaring me mentally unfit to manage my affairs due to severe emotional instability following the birth of my daughter. My breath hitched in my throat as I read the signatures on the final page of that document. The illegible scrawl at the bottom belonged to my husband Thomas, but right above it, written in clear, elegant cursive, was the signature of my own mother. They had signed away my rights, my career, and my parental authority, while I was downstairs making dinner for the family. In that frozen instant, the soft murmur of laughter drifted up through the floorboards from the patio below. I walked to the window and pushed aside the heavy linen curtain, just enough to see into the garden. Thomas was standing by the outdoor fireplace, pouring a glass of wine for Evelyn, while my mother sat in the armchair beside them, smiling with a warmth she had never once directed toward me in my entire life. I stood in the shadows of my own bedroom, holding the paper that officially declared me insane, and realized that my entire existence had been a carefully orchestrated illusion. I had built their lives with my own hands, and now they were preparing to erase me completely. To understand how I ended up standing in the shadows of my own bedroom, holding a document that stripped away my sanity and my freedom, you have to understand the foundation upon which my entire life was built. I spent 14 years convinced that devotion to one's family was the highest virtue a person could possess. My father had been a self-made master builder and structural draftsman who built sterling heritage architecture from a small dusty shed into one of the most respected historic restoration firms in the county. He was a quiet, practical man who taught me how to read blueprints before I learned how to drive, showing me that every strong structure relies on hidden support beams that carry the load without ever demanding praise. When my father passed away 6 years ago, he left the firm under a dual governance structure. Because I possessed the architectural qualifications, the professional licenses, and the actual technical expertise, I inherited 60% of the operational voting shares. The remaining 40% was divided between my mother, Margaret, and my younger sister, Evelyn. My mother had spent her life cultivating an image of delicate aristocratic grace, perpetually dissatisfied with the sawdust on my father's boots and the hard grease under his fingernails. Evelyn was 15 years younger than me, a woman who moved through life with effortless charm, always showered with praise for simply existing while I silently carried the weight of our family's practical survival. 3 years into my marriage to Thomas, a charming property solicitor who convinced me that his legal background would be invaluable to the family business, we welcomed our daughter, Beatrice. It was a difficult pregnancy that culminated in a harrowing emergency section and months of physical exhaustion. During that vulnerable period, Thomas gently suggested that he handle the administrative and corporate governance of sterling heritage while I focused on my recovery and raising our newborn. I trusted him without hesitation. He was my husband, the man who held my hand through the long nights of my daughter's infancy, the partner who promised to protect our family's future. I threw myself into the artistic and technical heart of the business, restoring historic country houses, securing lucrative government heritage grants, and working late into the night while Thomas managed the legal contracts, payroll, and corporate filings. My mother openly praised Thomas at every family dinner, often reminding me how fortunate I was that a man of his standing had agreed to shoulder the burden of my father's company. Whenever Evelyn required financial assistance for her failed luxury fashion ventures, her expensive trips abroad, or her lavish apartments in London, it was always Thomas who adjusted the company ledgers to accommodate her requests, always reassuring me that keeping peace in the family was worth every penny. The first subtle crack in this carefully constructed reality appeared 3 months ago during a routine audit for a high-profile heritage project on an 18th-century estate in Sussex. While reviewing the insurance filings and property deeds in the regional registry office, I noticed that several historical land parcels adjacent to our restoration sites had been quietly acquired by an anonymous holding company called Marling Developments. When I brought the coincidence to Thomas over breakfast, pointing out that the corporate address was registered to a small law firm in Mayfair, his reaction was strangely sharp. He snapped that I was overstepping into corporate legal matters that did not concern my design work, claiming that my lingering fatigue from balancing work and motherhood was making me overly paranoid. I swallowed my doubts, feeling a familiar twinge of guilt. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the years of late nights and relentless pressure were finally taking a toll on my mind. My mother reinforced this narrative every time she visited our home, making quiet, pitying comments about my appearance, asking if I was taking proper rest, and gently taking Beatrice out of the room whenever I expressed the slightest frustration or stress. They created an environment where my confidence slowly eroded, leaving me entirely dependent on their reassurance. The subtle shift became a terrifying pattern 4 weeks ago when Evelyn announced she was moving to Milan for an extended sabbatical. She packed her bags, threw a lavish farewell dinner at our home, and kissed me on the cheek with an intensity that felt oddly final. Yet 2 days ago, while tidying the guest wing in our countryside manor, I found a dry cleaner's tag from a local shop in our village, dated just 3 days prior. Attached to the tag was a coat that unmistakably belonged to my sister. Why would Evelyn lie about being in Italy while secretly staying in our local village? Why was my mother spending hours behind closed doors with Thomas in his home office, locking the door whenever I approached the hallway? The questions gnawed at me. But every time I attempted to bring up these odd details, Thomas would look at me with deeply patronizing sympathy, stroke my hair, and ask if I had been forgetting to take my daily vitamins, hinting that my memory was becoming dangerously unreliable. Driven by a quiet, desperate need to prove to myself that I was not losing my mind, I waited until Thomas left for his weekly golf club meeting yesterday evening. I retrieved the spare key to his private study from the heavy antique clock in the library, a secret hiding place my father had shown me when we first moved into the house. I opened his filing cabinet, expecting to find perhaps a mismanaged contract or an unaccounted loan for Evelyn's debts. Instead, tucked behind years of tax filings, I found a thick leather-bound binder stamped with the crest of Marling Developments. Inside were land registry transfers, bank statements, and legal deeds showing that over 40% of Sterling Heritage's core assets had already been quietly liquidated and transferred directly to the shell corporation. But the true horror was the legal ownership structure of Marling Developments itself. The primary beneficiary was not a stranger. It was a private trust, set up jointly in the names of Thomas and Evelyn. My hands shook so violently that I almost dropped the ledger onto the floor. They were not just stealing money from the firm. They were systematically dismantling everything my father had built, stripping the company of its real estate holdings and leaving behind a hollowed-out corporate shell laden with millions of pounds in debt that remained tied directly to my name. Before I could process the vast scale of this financial execution, my eyes fell on a blue velvet box tucked at the bottom of the drawer. Inside lay the gold signet ring my father had given Evelyn on her 18th birthday. Beside it was the psychiatric evaluation document, signed by a corrupt private practitioner, declaring that I was suffering from severe delusional psychosis and chronic incapacity, recommending that full legal guardianship of my person, my assets, and my daughter be immediately assigned to my husband and my mother. The sound of car tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. I shoved the papers back into the cabinet, locked the wooden door, and rushed upstairs to my bedroom just as the front door swung open down below. Standing in the dark room, holding the stolen document against my chest, I listened as the voices of my husband, my mother, and my sister merged into a chorus of warm, familiar laughter in the hallway. They were not preparing to send me away for treatment. They were waiting for the final legal papers to be processed at the county court this coming Friday, at which point I would be forcibly removed from my home, stripped of my daughter, and blamed for the total bankruptcy of my father's business. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the cold paper crumbling in my tight grip as my tear-filled eyes locked onto the glowing digital clock on the nightstand. I had less than 4 days before they signed the final court order that would erase my existence entirely. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds over the estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the dining room table where my family sat eating breakfast. Looking at Thomas as he calmly buttered his toast, I felt a profound sense of disorientation, as if the man I had shared a bed with for 14 years was a complete stranger, wearing a familiar face. My mother sat opposite him, pouring tea from the silver pot my father had bought her for their silver anniversary, her hand steady and untrembling. Evelyn sat to her left, scrolling casually on her telephone, wearing the gold signet ring that I had seen on my bedside table only hours before. I forced myself to sit down among them, taking a small slice of dry toast and forcing a tired, weak smile onto my lips. Thomas reached across the table to lay his hand over mine, his fingers warm and reassuring, asking if I had managed to sleep well after such a restless night. I looked into his clear blue eyes, searching for any flicker of guilt or hesitation, but there was nothing except the smooth, polished surface of a practiced actor. I told him softly that I was feeling a little disoriented, allowing my voice to tremble just enough to satisfy his expectations. My mother exchanged a swift, knowing glance with Evelyn before turning back to me with an expression of maternal concern that made my stomach turn. As soon as Thomas left for the city office and my mother took Beatrice out to the garden, I retreated to my father's old architectural workshop at the back of the property. The stone building was cold and smelled of cedar wood and dusty paper, remaining untouched since the day he died. I locked the heavy timber door from the inside and pulled out a small burner telephone I had purchased in cash at the village post office early that morning. My fingers were trembling as I dialed the number of Arthur Pendleton, my father's old personal solicitor, who had retired to the coast 5 years ago after being quietly pushed out of the firm by Thomas. When Arthur answered, his deep, resonant voice brought a sudden lump to my throat, reminding me of a time when honor and truth were the foundations of my life. I explained the situation in careful, precise terms, telling him about the psychiatric evaluation document, the transfers to Marling Developments, and the sudden appearance of my sister. Arthur listened in complete silence for several minutes, the heavy silence on the line filled only by the sound of his measured breathing. When he finally spoke, his words shattered the remaining fragments of the world I thought I knew. He revealed that my father had never trusted Thomas entirely, having noticed subtle irregularities in the corporate accounts during the final months of his life. Before he passed away, my father had embedded a hidden protective clause in the founding charter of Sterling Heritage Architecture. That clause stated that any attempt to alter the operational control of the company or transfer its physical real estate assets required a mandatory, independent forensic audit conducted by a court-appointed surveyor. Arthur explained that the only way Thomas and my mother could bypass that mandatory legal audit was to declare me completely incapacitated before the annual shareholder meeting. If I was officially declared mentally unfit by a court order, my mother, as my designated legal guardian, would be granted immediate power of attorney to sign away my voting rights without triggering the protective audit clause. The horrifying scope of their plan began to take a clear, terrifying shape in my mind. They were not simply trying to steal my share of the firm or take my money. They needed me declared insane because my sanity stood as the only legal obstacle preventing them from liquidating the entire corporate structure and transferring tens of millions of pounds into their offshore accounts. Determined to find out what else they had hidden from me, I spent the next 3 hours going through the digital archives on my father's old offline server in the workshop. What I uncovered went far beyond financial greed. While examining the structural blueprints and building inspection filings for our flagship project, the restoration of the historic St. Jude Heritage Manor, I discovered a series of altered engineering reports bearing my personal professional stamp and digital signature. Thomas had quietly substituted the high-grade structural reinforcement beams required by county building regulations with cheap, uncertified steel imported through a bogus supplier owned by Marling Developments. He had siphoned off £4 million from the project budget while signing my name to the legal safety certificates. If those structural alterations were ever discovered by the local authorities, or if the building suffered a structural failure, the criminal liability would fall entirely on me as the lead architect. I would face years in a federal prison for corporate fraud and dangerous negligence, while Thomas, Evelyn, and my mother walked away with millions in clean cash. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to English Stories Hub. A simple like helps more people discover these stories, and your support inspires us to create new ones. Now, let's continue. My chest tightened until I could barely draw breath, the realization of their absolute cruelty washing over me like ice water. They had not just plotted to strip me of my inheritance and my daughter. They had constructed a legal and professional trap that would ensure my complete destruction whether I fought back or not. If I stayed silent, I would be committed to a private psychiatric institution and stripped of my rights. If I attempted to expose their financial theft without addressing the structural filings, they would trigger an immediate building inspection and point the finger at my forged signature, leaving me facing criminal charges that would destroy my life forever. I leaned against the heavy oak work table, staring at the glowing blue screen as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. My mother's lifelong disdain for me, Evelyn's sudden return, and Thomas's relentless gaslighting were not isolated elements of a family rift. They were coordinated moves in a long, methodical campaign designed to eliminate me from the equation before the St. Jude project reached its final completion date. I spent the next hour downloading every original CAD drawing, every raw email file, and every unedited bank transaction onto an encrypted hard drive. I recorded the exact timestamps, the IP addresses used to forge my digital signature, and the serial numbers of the uncertified steel shipments delivered to the construction site. My father had taught me that every structure leaves a paper trail, and no matter how carefully a liar builds his house, the truth remains embedded in the foundation. Just as I was preparing to disconnect the drive and hide it inside my father's old wooden tool chest, my burner telephone vibrated on the desk. It was an urgent text message from Arthur Pendleton containing a scanned document he had just retrieved from his contact at the regional county courthouse. My heart stopped beating as I opened the attached image on the small screen. The document was an official court summons for an emergency guardianship hearing regarding my mental capacity. Thomas and his corrupt physician had not scheduled the hearing for Friday, as the papers in his desk had indicated. They had intentionally placed a false document in the study to give me a false sense of time while quietly filing an expedited emergency petition with the probate judge. The hearing was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock in the county court downtown. If I failed to appear, or if I appeared unprepared without legal representation, the judge would issue an immediate ex parte order placing me under the permanent legal guardianship of my mother and granting Thomas full control over my person and my assets before the sun set tomorrow afternoon. I spent the remaining hours of the evening preparing my defense with terrifying precision, refusing to let emotion blind my judgment. I met Arthur Pendleton at a quiet diner 5 miles outside the village, where we laid out the physical evidence, the original CAD drawings, and the certified banking logs across the worn plastic booth. Arthur reviewed the forensic audit files line by line, his eyes widening as he realized the sheer scale of the legal trap Thomas and my mother had constructed. Together, we drafted a counter-petition for the court, attaching the encrypted server logs that proved my digital signature had been systematically forged from an IP address inside Thomas's personal home office. When I arrived at the county courthouse the following morning at 8:30, the grand stone hallway was completely quiet except for the muffled sound of my heels against the polished marble floor. Thomas sat on a mahogany bench outside courtroom 4, flanked by my mother and Evelyn, all 3 of them dressed in understated dark attire designed to convey the tragic solemnity of a family dealing with a sick relative. Thomas looked up as I approached, his face instantly transforming into a mask of tender, practiced concern that made my skin crawl. He stood up slowly, stepping forward with his hands open in a soothing gesture, asking me gently why I had driven myself to court when I was supposed to be resting at home under my mother's care. I did not pause or slow my pace as I walked directly past him toward the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. I looked him dead in the eye, telling him in a low, unwavering voice that his performance was over and that we had an appointment with the judge. The color drained from his face for a split second before my mother stepped forward, her hand tightening around her pearl necklace as she whispered furiously that I was making a scene and destroying what little dignity I had left. Evelyn stayed near the wall, shifting her weight nervously and twisting her gold signet ring around her finger, avoiding my gaze for the very first time in her life. When the bailiff called our case, we walked into the wood-paneled courtroom, where Judge Harrison sat behind the elevated bench, reviewing the preliminary emergency filing. Thomas's high-priced corporate barrister stood up immediately, launching into a rehearsed speech about my supposed severe psychological decline, citing the fabricated medical report and describing how my alleged hallucinations were endangering the future of sterling heritage architecture. He presented my mother as a heartbroken matriarch forced to take legal control to protect both her daughter and her granddaughter from irreversible financial ruin. Judge Harrison listened attentively, nodding slowly as he looked over the documents provided by Thomas's legal team. When the barrister finished his presentation, the judge turned his gaze toward my side of the room, asking if the respondent had any legal representation or anything to say before he issued the emergency guardianship order. At that exact moment, Arthur Pendleton stepped through the back doors of the courtroom carrying 2 heavy leather satchels filled with sworn affidavits and original technical records. He took his position beside me at the defense table, bowing respectfully to the bench, before declaring that we were contesting the petition in its entirety on the grounds of deliberate corporate fraud, criminal perjury, and document falsification. The courtroom fell into a shocked silence as Arthur laid out our evidence with surgical efficiency. He presented the independent forensic analysis showing that the medical evaluation had been bought and paid for through an offshore transfer from Marling Developments to the physician's private bank account. He then projected the digital logs onto the courtroom display screen, showing the exact timestamps when Thomas had forged my signature on the uncertified steel certificates for the St. Jude Heritage Manor project. Thomas jumped to his feet, his calm exterior completely shattering as he shouted that the evidence was fabricated and that I was using stolen corporate data to slander my own family. My mother gasped loudly, clutching her chest and crying out that I was driven by malice, while Evelyn shrank back into her chair, her face turned pale as paper. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel down onto the wooden block, commanding silence in the court and warning Thomas that another outburst would result in immediate contempt charges. The judge carefully examined the verified bank logs, the land registry filings, and the structural safety reports, his brow furrowing deeper with every page he turned. He looked down from the bench at Thomas and my mother, his eyes cold and severe, as he noted that the court had been weaponized in an attempt to cover up massive corporate malfeasance. Judge Harrison formally dismissed the guardianship petition with prejudice, declaring me entirely competent and ordering an immediate injunction against Thomas, my mother, and Evelyn. He froze all assets associated with Marling Developments, revoked Thomas's administrative access to Sterling Heritage, and ordered the local sheriff to escort Thomas from our family home that very afternoon. As we stepped out of the courthouse doors into the bright midday sun, Thomas caught up with me on the stone steps, his face contorted with desperation and rage. He grabbed my arm tightly, whispering that I had destroyed everything and that the county inspectors were already on their way to the St. Jude site because of the structural filings. He smirked through his panic, telling me that regardless of the court decision, my career was finished because my name was on those safety certificates, and the building would be condemned within hours. I pulled my arm out of his grip with steady, deliberate strength, looking at him with a quiet satisfaction that made his smile vanish instantly. I informed him softly that I had personally delivered the original, uncorrupted engineering files and the video footage of the uncertified steel deliveries to the chief building inspector and the fraud squad 2 hours before the court session even began. Before Thomas could utter another word, 2 unmarked police sedans pulled up to the curb at the bottom of the steps, and 4 plainclothes detectives stepped out, walking directly up the stairs toward us with official warrants in their hands. The lead detective stepped up the marble stairs, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket as he addressed Thomas by his full legal name. The official police warrant was for corporate fraud, forgery, and public endangerment related to the uncertified structural materials used on the St. Jude site. The 2 officers placed Thomas under arrest right there on the courthouse steps, pulling his hands behind his back and clicking the steel handcuffs into place, while dozens of journalists and local business owners looked on in utter shock. My mother began to weep loudly, trying to reach out to Thomas as he was led down the steps toward the waiting police sedan, but her voice faltered when the second pair of detectives turned their attention toward her and Evelyn, because the bank logs and land registry documents from Marling Developments clearly listed my mother and sister as co-conspirators and primary financial beneficiaries. They were both handed formal legal summonses for questioning regarding tax evasion and money laundering. Evelyn shrank into herself, her confident composure entirely gone as she buried her face in her hands, while my mother stared at me with an expression of sheer disbelief, unable to comprehend that the quiet daughter she had spent decades dismissing had just dismantled her entire world. I stood at the top of the stone steps beside Arthur Pendleton, watching silently as the police cars pulled away into the afternoon traffic. The legal fight was far from over, but the immediate threat to my sanity, my daughter, and my father's legacy had been utterly destroyed. The fear that had weighed on my chest for months was completely gone, replaced by a profound, unwavering calm that I had never experienced before in my entire life. Over the next 6 months, the consequences of their choices unfolded with absolute legal precision. The criminal trial revealed the full extent of the scheme, showing that Thomas had been siphoning corporate funds for over 5 years to cover massive personal gambling debts and fund Evelyn's lavish lifestyle. Faced with overwhelming digital and physical evidence, Thomas accepted a plea bargain that resulted in a 7-year prison sentence. My mother was forced to liquidate her private estate and sell her vintage jewelry to pay back the millions of pounds stolen from sterling heritage, while Evelyn received a suspended sentence and 400 hours of community service, her social standing and reputation irrevocably ruined. I took full control of Sterling Heritage Architecture as the sole director and majority shareholder. With Arthur's assistance and a team of honest engineers, we systematically removed the defective steel from the St. Jude Heritage Manor project, replacing it with certified materials and completing the restoration to the highest technical standards. The local council commended the firm for its transparency and integrity, and within a year, our reputation was fully restored, attracting new heritage projects from across the country. I moved out of the old manor house and purchased a bright, sunlit stone cottage near the coast, complete with a large garden where Beatrice plays freely after school. I reinstated my father's original founding principles, hanging his wooden architectural T-square above my desk in my new home office as a daily reminder of where I came from and what I survived. Looking back on that dark night when I found the forged psychiatric evaluation in Thomas's study, I no longer feel anger or betrayal. They tried to build a life on deception, treating me as a weak, silent foundation that they could load with their greed until I collapsed under the weight. They failed to realize that my father had taught me how to read the load-bearing points of every structure, and when a foundation is pushed too far, it does not crumble, it stands firm, while everything built on lies comes crashing down. My victory was never about revenge or watching them suffer in court. It was about reclaiming my name, protecting my child, and restoring the truth to my father's legacy. I finally reclaimed my own life, and for the very first time, I am building a future on a foundation that will never break. Thank you for spending your time with us. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and let us know what you thought. We'd also love to hear what kind of stories you'd like to listen to next. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to English Stories Hub. A new story is coming soon, and we can't wait to share it with you. Thank you for your support, your comments, and for being part of our community. Until next time. Take care and keep the stories alive.